Welcome to Rescue the Heart. Today's story is about a blind cat we rescued in Turkey. Although told through a historic setting for this story, this rescue did happen. Please join us, and if you feel like you enjoy the story, please feel free to donate to the charity we help set up in Turkey for stray and injured animals. Henry was home for the Easter break, and frankly, he had had enough of books for a while. Patch and Henry would go roaming around the vast countryside surrounding the old castle. Many people knew Henry and his faithful dog from their walks in the fields. Most smiled as they passed, grateful for a brief break from their work. Henry had become known as a scholar with a good head on his shoulders. He was Mr. Sutton's apprentice, a young man who did not shy away from hard work, but who seemed drawn to the outdoors, whatever the weather. A nice boy, but odd. Yes, a nice boy, just a little odd, people thought. When Henry and Patch returned home, the sky was looking unsettled. Grey clouds were rolling in, casting a dark shadow that threatened a downpour at any moment. It felt like a warning of something coming, something bad. Henry was glad to be home, sitting by the fire with a bowl of hot soup and a thick chunk of homemade bread dripping with butter. The conversation turned to the city and what was or wasn't being done. Mr. Sutton had heard that the malignant fever had come to their town. Though the words were spoken quietly, fear landed like a loud boom in the room. Medical science at the time was, at best, a bit of guesswork mixed with a dash of past experience. Things had moved forward, but the true cause of the sickness was still unknown and deeply misunderstood. Bad air was believed to spread the fever. Then again, the working folk believed many odd tales of how or why the sickness had come to their city. Theories ranged from witchcraft to God's fury, from bad air to having simply crossed paths with an evil cat. Fear ruled the streets. Symptoms varied widely, but loosely followed a grim pattern. First came the chills. Then came false hope, where the patient seemed to have broken the fever and felt better. But this was quickly followed by the eruption of small red spots, first inside the mouth and then all over the body. These spots turned hard and blistered. Many suffered excruciating pain as the skin peeled and the blisters joined together. Not finished with you just yet, the second fever would arrive, leaving your body covered in crusty scabs. It was no wonder there was such panic when word spread that the malignant fever had come to Devizes. Many died. The old way of treating this was to heat the patient up. Carers would make them as hot as possible, sealing the windows and doors tightly. The room would become stiflingly hot, assuming you could afford the fuel for the fire. The new way was simpler: no fires, open windows, and light bedding to cool the body naturally. This didn't cure you, but it offered relief. One problem with this modern approach, however, was that family members had less to actively do, leaving them feeling helplessly as though they were not aiding the patient. Henry listened to Mr. and Mrs. Sutton talking, and a cold fear gripped him. Patch jumped onto his lap as if to offer support, his warm presence saying, "Don't worry, I'm here." This helped Henry feel a little calmer. Over the next week, things changed. People were less friendly, no longer stopping for a chat, but rushing home as quickly as their legs could carry them. People started to tightly cover their mouths in the hope of not catching the bad air. Then, devastating news came to the Suttons. The malignant fever was at the workhouse in Snuff Street. True fear had now gripped them. Both Jane and Henry felt the heavy weight of worry. Knowing what the workhouse was like and how little those poor souls were cared for simply broke their hearts. Mr. and Mrs. Sutton immediately decided to gather blankets and warm clothes to help. Mrs. Sutton and Jane set to work making potions and healing salves for the sick. They brewed borage tea for its anti-inflammatory effects alongside elderflower tea. They mixed creams from lard and marigold, which boasted wonderful antiseptic properties to soothe the blistered skin. For sore throats, they prepared sage with sweet honey. Mrs. Sutton used her advanced skills to prepare a four thieves vinegar. This took time to make, but it would be desperately needed if the outbreak worsened. Jane was learning the ways of being a herb wife and proved to be a tremendous help. Soon, everything was ready. Mrs. Sutton asked Henry to take the supplies down to the workhouse. She strictly warned Henry to cover his mouth with a thick scarf she handed him. He was on no account to set foot inside that building. Instead, he was to ask for Mrs. Rogers, a long-time carer of the poor. She was there, bravely trying to stop the spread. God bless her. Henry was terrified. He wasn't just afraid of the outbreak, but of having to return to the Snuff Street workhouse. The memories were still there, sharp and intensely painful. The loss of his mother, the sickness, the total loss of all hope. Panic gripped him. Noticing his distress, Jane came silently beside him, taking his hand tightly in hers. They shared a look of total understanding, care and support. "I'll put the kettle on and make you a sweet tea for when you come back," Jane said softly. They were simple words, but they helped Henry realize she was anchoring him in the present, pulling him away from his dark past. Henry took the cart and the last-minute instructions from Mrs. Sutton and set off. He was still fearful, but not quite as badly as before. The journey was uneventful. Patch sat happily at his side, pleased for the sudden outing. However, a chill gripped Henry's spine as he pulled into Snuff Street. Patch understood this immediately, pressing firmly against Henry's leg to comfort him. At the workhouse courtyard stood Mrs. Rogers, accompanied by 2 workhouse boys, ready to help unload the cart. Henry pulled the thick scarf tightly around his face as he climbed down. He handed Mrs. Rogers the bottles of medications and creams, relaying all the instructions Mrs. Sutton had sent. "God bless you," shouted Mrs. Rogers over the courtyard noise. Out of the corner of his eye, Henry saw a small child chasing something furry that was moving in an odd, erratic way. The creature stayed close to the ground, terrified, swinging its head wildly as if blindly searching for an escape. Suddenly, a workhouse helper started to yell. It was a vicious, angry voice, one that struck absolute fear into Henry, even after all these years. "Get out of the way," the man bellowed, shoving the small child hard to the ground. He raised a heavy wooden stick he always carried. He was a cruel bully who would sooner beat you with it for the slightest offence than look at you. Before he had a chance to think, Henry found himself sprinting over and snatching the stick straight from the man's grasp. "No, you don't!" Henry shouted. He tossed the heavy stick far away from the child, the man, and the frightened animal. The first thing Henry noticed was how tall he himself had grown. That terrifying childhood bully suddenly seemed so very small. The second thing he noticed was that his fear of the man had completely vanished. Turning the tables, Henry asked in his most commanding, educated voice, "What do you think you are doing?" The man sneered and replied, "Killing the cat that brought this plague upon us." Stepping forward, Henry swept the little cat up into his arms in one swift motion. Looking down at the creature, he could see it was filthy, scrawny, and trembling with fright. "I'll take it from you," Henry said. He grabbed a canvas sack from the cart and gently placed the cat inside, loosely tying the top so the poor thing couldn't escape. Henry breathed hard. He suddenly realized the cruel man hadn't even recognized him. The bully truly didn't care who he hurt. All residual fear drained from Henry as he hopped back up into the cart. As he pulled away with Patch sitting faithfully beside him, Henry knew with absolute certainty that he would never again feel fear of that horrible place. His life was finally his own to choose. The journey home was fast, and Henry's heart felt incredibly light. Occasionally, the sack shifted, and a small pitiful wail echoed from inside. Henry desperately hoped he had done the right thing in bringing the cat back to his home and to the wonderful Sutton family. What if he had made a terrible mistake? For a brief moment, he had considered releasing the cat into the open fields. But his deep love for animals and his careful training in their care stopped him. He would ask Mr. Sutton what was to be done before taking any further steps. True to her word, Jane had a hot brew waiting. It was beautifully sweet, just the right tea for Henry, who looked horribly pale and thoughtful after his extraordinary morning. Mr. Sutton was out at one of the farmlands, so showing him the rescued animal would simply have to wait. After finishing his tea, Henry went out to the barn with the sack he had brought from the cart. Trying not to panic, Henry opened the bag. Peering inside, his eyes landed on a tiny dirt-covered cat. But as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. The cat appeared to be entirely blind. Henry froze for several seconds, his mind racing. Had he indeed brought the dreaded fever into their home? Terrified, he carefully placed the cat into a deep wooden box with a bowl of fresh water, making absolutely sure it couldn't escape and spread the plague. Saying a quick, desperate prayer, he dashed off to finish his chores, swearing to find Mr. Sutton the very second he returned. Half an hour later, Jane went out to the barn to check on some herbs she was drying. Suddenly, she heard a soft, pathetic cry coming from a box in the corner. She lifted the lid to see what was inside, and her heart instantly broke. There sat a painfully thin cat with matted, filthy fur and severely damaged eyes. Speaking in a careful, quiet voice, Jane lowered her hand. The poor cat leaned eagerly into her touch. Jane gently lifted the creature up into a warm embrace. The little cat sniffed the air and immediately began to purr, settling gratefully into Jane's loving arms. Seeing how incredibly gentle the animal was, Jane carried it into the house to show Mrs. Sutton the sweet creature she had found in the barn. Mrs. Sutton saw immediately how affectionate the cat was, and soon the ladies decided exactly what was needed. First, a warm bath and a thorough brushing. A large kettle was set to boil, and a mild bar of soap was readied. Working together and talking gently to soothe the frightened animal, the bath was soon finished. The cat looked remarkably better once the thick layers of dirt and painful tangles had been washed away. After drying and brushing her as best they could, Mrs. Sutton offered the cat a generous bowl of food, which vanished in seconds. Both Jane and Mrs. Sutton could clearly see the cat was blind, but the way she lifted her chin, sniffed the air, and turned her head from side to side made them suspect she could still perceive shifting shadows. She had just a tiny glimmer of sight. With a full belly and beautifully clean fur, she settled into a cozy box they had placed right by the fireside. Resting peacefully, the little cat fell into a deep sleep, knowing at long last she was completely safe. Mr. Sutton returned to the farm a little after 3 o'clock, only to be ambushed by a frantic Henry. The boy spoke a mile a minute about the workhouse, a violent bully, a blind cat, the malignant fever, and his terrifying fear that he had brought the plague right to their front door. Mr. Sutton placed a steadying hand on Henry's shoulder. "Slow down, lad," he said kindly. "Tell me everything, one piece at a time." Young Henry took a deep breath. He explained how he had gone to the workhouse and dropped off the medicine, how he had stopped the cruel workhouse master from beating a defenseless cat, how the bully had confidently claimed the cat had brought the fever, how he had scooped the animal into a sack, only to later discover its ruined, strange-looking eyes. Finally, he confessed his terrible dread that the cat was infected. Mr. Sutton smiled warmly. He reassured Henry that his friends in the medical profession strongly believed the fever was carried on bad air, not by stray animals or local witchery. "Let's go and see this cat you saved," said Mr. Sutton. They marched out to the barn, only to find an empty wooden box. Henry frantically searched the shadows, but there was no sign of the blind cat anywhere. Baffled as to what could have happened, they walked back to the house, knowing nothing could be done if they couldn't find the animal. To Henry's initial horror as they entered the sitting room, there was the very same cat, sleeping soundly by the fire. Mr. Sutton scooped the animal up gently, while Mrs. Sutton and Jane happily explained their rescue mission. Examining the now clean and contented creature, Mr. Sutton looked closely at her eyes. He explained that she was indeed blind, but that it had likely happened due to a severe infection when she was just a tiny kitten. If it had been caught at that young age, treatments might have worked, but now she would forever remain a blind cat. Jane's heart melted as she tucked the cat safely back into her bed. "I'll keep her if I may," Jane said quietly. They all looked at her with warm smiles. "I'm going to call her Bella, somehow." This felt perfectly fitting to them all. Jane and Bella became fast friends. Both shared a deep love for nature, often going on slow, careful walks together. Bella learned to follow Jane closely by tracking her sound and movement. It was a true wonder to witness. Henry would often marvel at how Bella used her long whiskers and her slight sensitivity to light to navigate the house. In places she knew well, she acted just like a perfectly normal cat, easily leaping onto a favorite chair whenever she pleased. Bella loved the whole family, but it was Jane she loved best. On long, quiet evenings, she would curl up on the girl's lap, sleeping in absolute peace. In the end, the malignant fever didn't spread. Thanks to the swift, selfless work of the town's carers, only one poor soul was lost to it. 5 others contracted the sickness and eventually recovered, though it must be said, their lives would never be quite the same, as the deep physical scarring of the fever would stay with them forever. But Devizes was safe. The plague, thankfully, went no further. We hope you enjoyed this story, and if you did, please think about donating to a worthwhile charity, either ours or a local one to you. If you liked this video, then like and share. It really helps us out.